What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the Indiana Jones review series. And now we are at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the closing chapter of the original trilogy and what for many years was believed to be the end of this character and the end of this story. But as we all know, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So I have a very strange relationship with this film. Now, as a kid, as I've said in the previous two reviews, I watched Raiders of the Lost Ark and especially Temple of Doom quite a lot growing up. And I certainly had seen The Last Crusade because my dad had all three on VHS. In fact, I actually can remember what the VHS was. It was one of those home videos that you actually buy and like record over the tape. And he took like a newspaper printout of The Last Crusade and taped it over the box, made his own little makeshift VHS cover. I can still picture it to this day. But for whatever reason, I didn't dislike The Last Crusade, but it always felt so much softer than the first two films that I just never really was in the mood to watch it as a kid. If I was ever in an Indiana Jones mood, it was always Raiders of the Lost Ark or more often Temple of Doom. And so I actually grew up into adulthood with not a whole lot of memories and certainly not much nostalgia for The Last Crusade, to the point where about maybe 4 years ago, The Last Crusade was being shown on one of the flashback cinema nights on my local theater. Every Wednesday and Sunday they play an older movie and it changes every week. And so the fact that I had very little memory of what actually happened in this movie, for all intents and purposes, you might as well say that I saw this movie for the first time just a few years ago and saw it for the first time on the big screen. So that's kind of cool. And so it puts me in an interesting position because there are so many people that adore The Last Crusade. I mean, most people would agree that the original trilogy are all pretty consistent in quality and all three of those movies are absolute classics. And I would actually agree with that, despite some of my thoughts on Last Crusade. But quite a few people that I know and trust their movie opinions, actually more people than not, consider The Last Crusade to be the best of this franchise. My dad has always said this is his favorite of the franchise. I believe Uncle Sean, this is his favorite of the franchise. And I've just never quite understood that one. I've always found this movie to be the most overrated of the original trilogy. But don't get too worried, I'm not going to bash this thing. I still think it's a great movie. There's just a couple of issues that I have with it that always makes it the least appealing of the original trilogy for me. But starting off with the positives regarding Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, easily the best thing, the most noteworthy thing about this movie is the team up of Harrison Ford and Sean Connery. Their on-screen chemistry, their back and forth dynamic, the humor and the dad and the son vibe going on.
Dad! Oh, Dad! Oh, Dad! What? Head for the fireplace!
And there's also a little bit of an in-joke in there because Indiana Jones was always kind of an idea that was born out of James Bond and a couple other things mixed together. And so you literally have James Bond as the father of Indiana Jones. And I just think their on-screen chemistry is great. Sean Connery plays the older dad very well, and he's a very different character than Indiana Jones. He's a little bit more scholarly, a little bit more of a godly man, and so there's certain elements of him that you could see causing a lot of tension and frustration between them, but it's always fun. Whether it's a physical gag with them being tied back to back on some chairs and Sean Connery lights the floor on fire, or them trying to figure out a situation, how to survive, and they have very different ways of going about it. They're extremely entertaining, and the movie picks up significantly once Sean Connery is brought into the fold. And mostly because of their relationship, I think this is probably the funniest of the original trilogy. There's a lot more attempts at humor here, whether it is physical gags or just dialogue between them and the bickering, but it's going for more of that family-friendly tone, and so there's a lot more sight gags, there's a lot more humor implemented into this. It's a lot lighter toned of a movie, and it is just a really fun adventure to go on. And there's plenty of laugh out loud moments and fun situations that is always fun to revisit when you rewatch this one.
If I just sit down and think... solution presents itself.
The opening 10 minutes or so of this movie is one of the most fun intros of this entire franchise. I still think Raiders is the best intro. It's one of the best opening sequences of any movie ever, and it's just it's damn near impossible to top that movie for me, but I really enjoy the opening 10 minutes here of like the origins of younger Indiana Jones, where you have River Phoenix as a Boy Scout and he stumbles upon these grave robbers and a guy that has the whole getup of Indiana Jones with the fedora and the jacket. And I like the way that it's kind of gives these elements that are really cute origins for very classic elements of Indiana Jones, like his fear of snakes and his use of a whip. It's a very fun sequence that isn't overly heavy-handed with just setting up all of these little elements of the character. Like the whole thing, you're just kind of laughing and have a smile on your face as they very creatively create the beginnings of this character that we have known and loved for so long. And there's also an interesting little detail in here to where Indiana Jones is taking on these robbers and these tomb raiders and taking their treasure, this cross, to try to get it away from them because he feels like it belongs in a museum. And it sets up this really interesting origin point to where when you watch the films later on where you have Temple of Doom and then Raiders and then the rest of Last of Crusade, it does set up an interesting little character dynamic and a character arc for Indiana Jones to kind of grow throughout these films. Like one of the things I said, just as an isolated story in Raiders, there's not really like a standout character arc for Indiana Jones in that movie, but across this original trilogy, while it is out of sequence, there is a really nice character arc across the 3 films. And aside from the really fun sequence in the beginning and running across the train cars and all of the excitement you get in the opening, there's a lot of really solid action scenes in here. You have the scene on the tank in the 3rd act of the film. You've got probably my favorite of the movie, which is the boat chase, and where he's got the guy and he's threatening to kill him as the propeller's just tearing up the boat behind him. A really cool, practical shot. Again, over and over, I keep talking about it. Practical, practical, practical. And it's absolutely worth saying for a 3rd time. The old school way that they used to film these action sequences with practical effects and stunt work and real in-camera designs and in-camera effects. I mean, it's just, you can't recreate that. And the magic that this original trilogy had that makes it stand the test of time and makes it be just as exciting today as it was back in the 80s, it's all because of that. And just really need to reinforce that point before we talk about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I really enjoyed Marcus Brody coming back and getting much more of an expanded and much more involved role than he had in Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think that actor brings a lot of fun to that character, and there's a nice comedic relief element to him, and just his presence balances out this group quite a bit. So I'll have more to say regarding some of the Raiders elements that they stick to later on in the video, but that's the one element from Raiders that they brought back that I think that they actually did a nice job at expanding the usage of it. And finally, I do really enjoy the MacGuffin item here, as well as the 3rd act supernatural twist that we get, which pretty much all these movies follow that template to where they're finding something, and by the end, whatever power it has, suddenly our characters have to deal with that. I think that easily the Holy Grail and the immortality and the whole room with all of the goblets and the knight from the First Crusade who's been there for 1,000+ years guarding all of it, that's the coolest reveals and the coolest execution next to the Ark of the Lost Ark. The Ark of the Covenant in Raiders of the Lost Ark. So these movies have always gone just up to the line of maybe too much supernatural for the grounded nature of these movies, but I think Raiders and Last Crusade do the best job at keeping it exciting and interesting enough with never going too far, never pushing that boundary to where now it's just too much for the tone of the film. Moving on to the mixed elements. Now, they pulled a lot of Raiders elements into this film as far as kind of their skeleton of setting up the story and setting up the progression of events of this film. Now, there's a lot of uniqueness here, which is why it's in the mixed. If it was all just kind of a retread and a rehash of Raiders, it would most likely be in my negatives. So I appreciate the fact that they just use it as a guideline while doing a lot of different and more unique things and taking the characters to different places and having different types of action sequences that certainly makes Last Crusade stand on its own. But I do feel like the movie, for my own personal taste, does stick a little too close to Raiders. You have this adventure that they are set off on to find this MacGuffin item that's involved with the Christian religion, and they have the Nazi-type bad guys there trying to get to it, and it's just this constant race where one person gets a step ahead of the other, and then a final betrayal, and they can't even really use the item. It just kind of, it sticks to specific beats of Raiders pretty closely. And again, they do a good job with it. I do like more about the way that they implement those elements than I have issues with. But I do think that's one of the elements that always made me a little less interested in this movie compared to the first two that were much more unique. And now moving on to the negatives. So if you have not already seen my review of the first two films, namely my Temple of Doom review, then you would not be aware that Temple of Doom is actually my favorite of this entire franchise. And I'm somebody that really enjoys the darker elements, the more intense elements they brought in that film. And I really appreciate a lot of the darker elements and the more violent stuff that they have in Raiders, that it's very easy to forget how violent that movie is until you go back and rewatch it, especially for an old school PG adventure film. And to me, this movie was not only an unnecessary course correction, but certainly an overcorrection from Temple of Doom, because that movie came out and didn't get nearly as much of the love that Raiders of the Lost Ark got, to where there was a lot of people that didn't like the violence. There was the creation of the PG-13 rating because of some of the quote-unquote outrage by parents about why such a violent movie was rated PG. You know, some of the more horror elements in there with the sacrifice and the hearts being ripped out and the bugs and the monkey brains. And I get it if that's not your thing. But to me, the first film is pretty violent, and this one is such a course correction that it's probably the most lighthearted, light-toned, and family-friendly of this entire franchise.
No ticket.
And don't get me wrong, it's a lot of fun. It's a very enjoyable chapter and it moves at a good pace. It's not something that really affects the quality of the movie, but just for my own taste, my own preferences, I'm always a bit less interested in the tone of this movie than the tone of the first two films, because I like my Indiana Jones to have a little bit of edge. I like there to be a little bit of violence and a little bit more danger in there. And this one doesn't quite have that edge whatsoever. It's much more of a family-friendly adventure, much more comedic, much more light-hearted and light-toned. And that's just not what I prefer in these movies. Moving on from that, I have always found Elsa and Donovan to be pretty weak antagonists. Donovan especially, I remember little to nothing about him. I actually had to look up the character's name on Google because I never remember what the fuck this dude's name is. He's not really intimidating. There's not an interesting villain motivation there. It's just another Nazi type guy that just wants power. And that's just the most generic motivation ever and a bit redundant for this franchise. Now, Elsa's the more interesting of the two, but for me, there's significant flaws with how the character is written that prevents her from being either a compelling love interest or a compelling villain. Now, on the love interest side, I just never really buy into the chemistry between her and Indiana Jones, aside from the hookup scene where they're in Venice and it's a really cute kind of comedic play up on James Bond tropes. That's really fun. But once she's revealed to be in bed with the Nazis, I never buy into his continuing softened heart for her, to where he keeps trying to pull her to the light, keeps trying to save her in certain situations, even though she's doing everything she can to fuck him over. And even by the end of the film, to where she's got the Holy Grail and she's trying to leave, like by that point, I'm just like, dude, this chick sucks. Why are you continuously trying to save her? Just to hell with her. And her villainous motivations, her motivation for what she's doing and why she aligns with who she aligns with is just never very clear to me, and it's never really compelling of what is pushing her? What is making her make these decisions? Why is she in bed with the Nazis, and then why does she make the decisions that she makes to then screw over the Nazis, and what is her end goal? It's just too unclear for me to really be all that interested in. But especially the third act, just a real big missed opportunity to kind of bring some interesting drama to that character and a bit more of a complicated feeling as the audience towards her, to where they get into the room with all of the goblets and she purposely gives the wrong one to Donovan so that he'll drink from it and die instantly. And then her and Indy get the fuck out of Dodge and go into the next room to save Sean Connery. And immediately she's like, Indy, we've got the Holy Grail, come with me. The rest of the world is our oyster, or whatever the fuck she says. And he's like, bitch, that guy just said, don't take the fucking thing past the seal. And what does she do? Immediately walks past the seal, causes the room to collapse, and damn near kills everybody. And just at that point, even when he's holding her, and she's trying to get the Grail, and he's holding her over the cracks, like, come on, sweetheart. Like, dude, fuck her, just drop her. And so while I won't go as far as to say that they're the weakest villains of this franchise, because they're not, they are without a doubt, by a landslide, the least interesting antagonists of this original trilogy for me. But overall, guys, I really do enjoy this film. For me, it's pretty much on par with the quality of the first two films. It's just the least appealing of the three for me because of that family-friendly tone, because of the huge course correction, and just some of the familiarity to Raiders. Solid as hell, exciting, fun, and if this was the final chapter of the Indiana Jones story, I think it's a damn good place to stop. But of the original trilogy, it's always been my least favorite of the three. Well, that's it for this one, guys. Be sure to click over here for all of my 2023 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my playlist of all of my Indiana Jones reviews, which as of the release of this video, we're only missing Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And then, of course, we'll rank these things here in probably 2 days. So, like, share, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of those videos in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.